Welcome to Teenagers Untangled, the audio hug for everyone supporting anyone going through the tween and teen years. I'm Rachel Richards, journalist, mother of 2 teenagers and 2 bonus daughters. Now, one of the UK's most famous families had a deeply personal conflict exposed in the public eye recently, and it's opened up a cultural conversation about something parents fear and few actually talk about. Brooklyn Beckham, the eldest son of David and Victoria Beckham, has publicly said he does not want to reconcile with his parents after a long reported family rift. This isn't about celebrity gossip, this is human pain. And what's happening with the Beckhams reflects something I'm getting quite a few emails about. So I think understanding estrangement and what leads to it may be one of the most important things we can do, both to protect our future relationships with our own children and support families who are going through it. Today, we're going to explore estrangement, what's driving it, whether it's genuinely helpful or harmful, and what the rise of no contact culture teaches us about how we can better parent our kids. To unpack all of this, I'm joined by the incredible Dr. Joshua Coleman, psychologist, author of the book Roles of Engagement, senior fellow of the Council of Contemporary Families, and one of the world's leading experts on parent-child estrangement. Welcome to Teenagers Untangled, Josh.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
I just want to say before we move on, you have the most amazing Substack, and I really urge people who are affected by any of this to come onto Substack and read your stuff. The link will be in the notes. So let's start with that. I wanted to ask you what you think has changed in modern parenting that might be fueling estrangement. And then when I looked at the figures, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot before 2000. So it's not like divorce figures where we can see a definite trend. What are your thoughts about this, the sparsity of the data?
Yeah, I think it's there's sort of a debate in my field about, well, there's always been estrangements and, now because of social media, people feel more comfortable being out there. I don't think that's accurate. I think that there's been a rise in estrangements over the past several decades as a result of, many things. I mean, divorce is certainly a big cause of estrangement for a variety of reasons. Social media is a big amplifier. Instagram, social media influencers in particular, who advise, the value of cutting off family. Toxic Parents has something like, or Toxic Family has something like 2 billion hashtag views on TikTok. That's huge. The increasing influence of therapy and therapists. Younger generations are much more likely to be in therapy. So the Council of Therapists who say, well, your parents are borderline or a narcissist or a sociopath, you'd be better off not having a relationship with them, even though they've never met the parent. That's an influence. Rising rates of mental illness, both for parents and adult children, can be a cause. There's a variety in the United States, political differences is a big cause of estrangement. So there are a lot of things that have occurred in the course of the half century, rising rates of individualism, but in particular in the last few decades in terms of the amplifying effects of social media that I think have contributed to this.
I'm very interested because I know you wrote a piece recently about the difference in cultures and how actually you consider this to be possibly more of a Western phenomenon. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, in the West, we're very oriented towards the individual. The United States, for example, has the highest rates of individualism than any other society. And what is individualism? Individualism is a preoccupation with one's own personal happiness, one's own personal growth, one's own identity. And so we prioritize that above everything. And the research on that really shows that people who are particularly oriented towards that tend to be less happy than those who have more of a identity based around relationships and the like. So in other cultures, really, we're the minority of the way that we sort of think about identity and selfhood. So, the Joseph Heinrich, the cultural anthropologist who wrote the book, The Weirdest People in the World, he says Westerners are the weirdest people in the world. And the weird is a acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. And what he said is that, in our countries, we look at relationships in a completely different way than in more communitarian societies, which is really more true. I mean, even in the United States, Latin American families are less prone to estrangement because they have more of a familial prioritization. Black mothers are sort of the least likely to be estranged of anybody. So even within the U.S., there are kind of these subcultural differences that matter as well. So cultures are a very big determinant of how we think about family relationships.
That is absolutely fascinating. And
Isn't it?
when you deal with people, to what extent do you find that the reasons for estrangement are to do with actual abuse compared with perhaps an emotional mismatch of unmet expectations and this Western viewpoint of what they deserve.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in general, from the adult child's perspective, they feel like the parent um, deserves to be estranged. And so most of the time when adult children cut off a parent, they say it's because of emotional abuse. But even there, it's very complicated because in the past 3 decades, we've really lowered the threshold of what we label as emotional abuse, trauma, harm, and neglect. So the generations are often talking past each other. Older generations who grew up with a very, much higher bar for what constitutes abuse or neglect, their younger generation adult children are coming to them and saying, you emotionally abused me, you neglected me, you traumatized me. And the parents like, I would have killed for your childhood. What are you even talking about? And
Right. Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
right. And so there's this, and that doesn't put the conversation on a very good footing because then the adult child feels like, well, see, that's very invalidating, which is part of what my therapist said you do. So, so you can see why estrangement it can get so easily triggered. So from the adult child's perspective, it's much more likely to be explained by abuse from that kind of perspective. But just, I think it's important to emphasize that there are multiple pathways to estrangement. There's divorce, there is abuse, clearly. I don't think the research shows that child abuse is not the most common cause of estrangement, but it's in there, right? Sometimes when it's the adult child gets married, in my survey of 1,600 estranged parents, 70% of them didn't become estranged until their child married. So we know
Wow.
that a parent's relationship to the new spouse or the spouse's feelings about the parents is hugely determinative of whether there's an estrangement. Again, mental illness, addictions, therapy, and sometimes, it's just because getting back to the parenting aspect, the downside of kind of the close, conscientious, anxious, guilt-ridden parenting we've been doing for the past, 3 or 4 decades is that sometimes our children get too much of us and they don't know any other way to feel separate from us than to cut us off. So for the
Oh,
longest time,
fascinating.
for the
Go
longest
on.
time, I've wanted to write an article with a title, something like, how can I have a rebellious adolescence when my parents are so nice? And so, right,
I love that. Oh, that's a really important, that's a really, really interesting point. So you're saying that
right.
actually our incredible sort of emotional openness and kindness to our children can actually feel like too much.
Well, right, because play has moved indoors in the past, two decades or so. You have smaller family sizes. Often you've got a divorced parent, and so it creates this kind of a hothouse in terms of the environment where the kid just sort of gets too much of mom and dad. And there's this kind of surveilling that can happen now with cell phones. And then they leave home, and the parent can still reach them from anywhere in the world within seconds, and then feel hurt or upset if they don't, text them back right away. All of this really intensifies the parent-adult-child relationship. I mean, in many ways, it's a good news, bad news. And, a lot of the surveys today show that today's parents feel closer to their adult children than they believe their parents felt to them at a similar age. So the good news is that this much more conscientious, psychological, involved, intensive parenting that we've been doing over the past few decades generally does result in a positive relationship. So I don't want to scare anybody, but I think that
No.
there are a subset. I think there are a subset of adult children who just can't organically separate. Like when I moved to San Francisco from Dayton, Ohio in my early 20s, I didn't have some way of like sending my pictures from my phone to my parents because the phone wasn't even, maybe I called them 2 weeks later because we took a long time to
Sure.
drive out here, called them collect when I got there. And that was it. So it's sort of easier to just become a separate adult through very low contact. But a lot of adult children don't have that luxury. So when they go low contact or no contact, it's because they just want less of that parent in their life, not necessarily. They may explain it by saying, "Oh, it's because the parent was so toxic or abusive or whatever." But sometimes it's just a rationalization for just wanting the parent to just back the hell up.
It's absolutely a fascinating point. And I actually had a lovely woman that I interviewed who's Desi, which is an Indian origin. And
Yeah,
she's gay. And so she ended up having to completely separate from her parents. And she was estranged for a while just to sort of remodel who she was in their
yeah.
eyes. And slowly they came back together. But I think underpinning that was the fact that she came from a culture where it was really important for a family to continue relationship. It was far too painful. And you, one of the things you've mentioned,
Right.
which I think is fascinating, you've mentioned it a few times, divorce. Why does that cause more estrangement?
Sure. There's four different reasons why it causes it. One is it can cause one parent to poison the child against the other parent, and that can happen whether the children are young or they're grown. The so-called gray divorce. Second of all, the child may blame one parent more than the other parent, even if it isn't that parent's fault, and even if the other parent's doing a reasonable job of not maligning that parent. Third, remarriage we know is a huge risk of estrangement, particularly for dads. Typically, if dads remarry when the kids are adults, kids are much more likely to ally with mom. Not always, but they're more likely to. Fourth, in a highly individualistic culture like ours, once a divorce happens, children are much more likely to see the parent more as individuals with their own kind of relative assets and liabilities, and less like a family unit that they're a part of. And fifth, when parents do remarry or recouple, they may not like the person that mom or dad married, and that person may not like them, or they may resent having to share emotional and material resources with the new children. So divorce is just a hotbed of potential causes of estrangement.
Fascinating. Yes. And I have seen that personally with people I know. And so if you have a child who is cutting off one parent in that situation, what would be your advice? Because for some of these kids, they say, well, I need this. I need to not talk to that person. I don't like them. I don't want to ally myself with them.
Yeah. What's my advice to the child, you're saying? I mean, in general, it isn't my position that people should never estrange, because there are truly abusive parents and family members where you just may not be able to be in a relationship with them. Um, but I do think it's important to give people a lot of runway if you're considering it, particularly if you're an adult child, you're considering cutting off a parent, because the consequences of that parent are so devastating. To have your child not talk to you, particularly to be cut off from your grandchildren, is typically, if an adult child cuts off the parent, they typically cut off access to the grandchildren. For the parent, it's kind of a double loss. So my wish for adult children who are considering it, when I say give a parent a lot of runway, is to really let them know what you want them and need them to work on in order to be in relationship with you. And then if they're not able to do it, to let them know that you're not sure that you can actually stay in relationship with them if they can't change. And then you may need to stop contact. But my other hope is that people, when they do go no contact, that they leave the door open to revisit it in a year. Because sometimes people don't really get how bad things are, until they've been left by the child. And that year may give them time to really do a deeper dive, reach out to a professional, really think much more deeply about why their adult child needed to do this, so that when the adult child comes back, then they're kind of willing and able to reconcile in a healthy way. So
I love that.
I'm no, thank you. Yeah, I'm not a fan of permanent strangers, because people, even the most seemingly hopeless people are often capable of change with the right care and the right direction. And the big tragedy about these estrangements is that the people who are the least able to are often the people who are the most traumatized themselves. And sometimes I'll hear adult child say, well, the cycle of trauma stops with me, and I'm going to cut you off. It's like, well, guess what? No, it's actually not stopping with you. You're actually perpetuating the trauma, because you're traumatizing your parent by cutting off access to them and their grandchildren. So you can say that the cycle of trauma is stopping with you. It's actually not. You're perpetuating it. You can say you need to do this for your own mental health. Fine. I buy that, maybe. But, the idea that you're ending the cycle of trauma, bullshit. I call bullshit on that.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yes, a very good point. And with parents, so let's say you're a parent and you've got a child who's now saying they want to estrange from you, and perhaps they are remembering events differently from the way you remember them. How should a parent deal with this?
As a parent, when your kid comes to you and complains about how you raised them or how you hurt them or whatever, it's human nature to be defensive, to feel defensive, to try to explain it away, to say that the kid misunderstood you, or they're mischaracterizing you, or you're remembering it wrong. That you shouldn't do any of that. That always backfires. The thing for parents of adult children to know is that nothing compels your adult child to have a relationship with you beyond that adult child's desire to have that relationship. And so, if you live in a culture like ours, you don't have the culture of saying, well, you have to talk to your parents, or you got to get isolated by the rest of the family or something. You might anyway, but it's not typically the culture that's kind of enforcing this in the way that other cultures do. And what that means is that parents have to be much more psychological and sensitive and responsive. And so I always tell parents, try to find the kernel, if not the bushel, of truth in the child's complaints about you. Know that if your child is raising it, they're probably raising it to have a better relationship with you or to heal something that's important about them and themselves that they need your help with. So defending yourself, explaining yourself, blaming the child, it's only going to work against you. I think that those are really the most important principles. And be open to do family therapy, be open to doing individual therapy if there's a need for that. So again, this highlights the way that the culture of family has shifted in the past half century away from honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, to this much more identitarian personal, growth, protect my mental health perspective. And that just means that parents, they just have to work much harder than our generation of parents had to work with us. I talk about this with my peers and my clients, and everybody says, well, we wouldn't have cut off our parents. It just wasn't really
No, no,
considered an option, no matter how bad they were. And it's not like any of us were telling our parents to make amends to us, for their bad
no.
parenting. So it's a totally new and different family dynamic that has to be navigated in a different way.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting because I did have problems with my parents' parenting of me, but through actually spending more time analyzing what they did, the way they grew up, the relationship they had with each other and with myself, it gave me much more
Mhm.
perspective. And I think that's the
Yeah,
problem. When you sort of cut it off, you don't get the chance to get that insight, which is
that's
really
right.
problematic.
It's very
Um,
problematic. Yeah.
as a parent, I think, oh God, if I had to give my child a year, that would be really painful for me. How can we tell the difference between giving them space and giving up?
Yeah, that's a hard one, particularly for mothers, because sometimes I will tell a parent you need to just go, just not even try for a year. Because sometimes it's the trying is the part that's triggering to the adult child. If they really need and want the space for the parent to keep pursuing them, feels disrespectful to the adult child or intrusive or like they're not really honoring the request. Whereas for mothers, it just feels so unmaternal. A lot of dads have an easier time with that, but for moms, it just feels so unmaternal to do that. It feels like I don't want my kid to feel like I don't care, like I'm neglecting them. I call it parenting at a distance. You're actually still being a parent, but you're doing it by giving your child something that they say that they really want or need, which is the time and the space. So no, it isn't. It isn't easy for any parent to do it. It's torturous for most.
And how does that fear of upsetting children shape the way that we parent and increase that risk? Because you talked about that. To what extent is this actually causing problems?
Well, I think that parents have given up too much of their authority in the past few decades. I think there's a place for because I said so. And so I don't think every parental decision has to be litigated or understood. The research on parenting shows that the parents who have the best outcomes with their children are those who are authoritative, meaning that
Oh,
it's a mix of being very comfortable with their authority, but also very affectionate and involved versus authoritarian, which is completely do it my way or the highway. I don't care how you feel. Or, neglectful, which is kind of like do whatever you want. I don't care. Authoritative is you're very involved, but it's also you're clear and comfortable with your own authority. I think part of the problem with social media and kind of, how much information there's about there about problematic parenting is that parents are so worried today that they're going to screw up their kid, if they do it
yeah,
wrong,
yeah.
they're going to end up estranged. And so it's really taken away their authority and it's given kids much more authority to kind of get what they want, not what they need, but what they want from the parent in ways that I think are really problematic.
I agree with you. And I have found with my older daughters, because they're my bonus daughters, that when they've thrown some things at me and I've pushed back and said, yes, but this, it's actually been
Uh,
much healthier. They've
yeah,
responded well to it because I think they needed someone to give them a different viewpoint. Yeah,
right.
and it's difficult. It's difficult to do, but I agree with you.
Exactly.
And to what extent do adult children sometimes confuse emotional discomfort with emotional harm? Because there's so much mental health talk.
I think it's a huge problem. And I think that it's partly our problem as parents because we have become so surveilling and conscientious and worried about our children. And that's partly an economic phenomenon. I always get annoyed when people are critical of helicopter parents because we had to become helicopter parents in the past 4 decades because of the way that government and businesses has shifted the responsibility of family life onto parents. It's what the political scientist Jacob Hacker calls the great risk shift. That prior to the 1980s and the development of the neoliberal economy in the United States and in England, for example, under ours under Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman, in the UK under Maggie Thatcher, there was a huge withdrawal of the state and businesses in terms of supporting parents. So parents have had to become much more helicoptering, intensive, even intrusive, because that was the only way to make sure that their kids are going to kind of get up through the narrow bottleneck into a successful life and career. In other countries, Scandinavian societies, for example, where there's enormous social supports, both in businesses and in the government, parents don't have to be so worried about it. So parents are more laissez-faire, they're more relaxed. So part of the downside of the way that we become much more intensive and conscientious and anxious, I mean, parents today is kind of like, oh my God, does my kid have ADD? Do they have learning disabilities? Do they need a tutor? Do they need a therapist? Do they need to be on medication? Because we're so worried that if we don't give them every single opportunity, they're not going to kind of get it through the narrow bottleneck into a successful life. So we become much more surveilling and thoughtful about their thoughts and feelings in ways that doesn't necessarily serve them, because it kind of makes those much more loud and, in front of their consciousness. So for example, I think about in terms of my own childhood, like when I was a kid, I used to have this fear of getting lost, but I wasn't diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And if I had, it would have been much worse, because then I would have had a disorder as opposed to this kind of just localized sort of phobia. And my father, to his credit, he would take me like to a hockey game or someplace, and when I was young, because he knew about it, and he'd say, "Okay, I'm going to go up into the stands, and I'm going to give you money to go buy the popcorn, which is all the way down the aisles, and you're going to find your way back up." Which initially it was kind of its own version of exposure therapy. He wasn't perfect. He also teased me about my fears of getting lost. But anyway, having a label isn't necessarily a good thing. It may help you with your feelings of shame, kind of like, well, that's my ADD, or that's my OCD, or that's my PTSD, or whatever. But it actually becomes much more part of your consciousness in ways it doesn't necessarily serve you. So one study said that something like 40% of Gen Z that was born between 1995 and 2012 have a diagnosis, and a high percentage of them say that that's one of the most important parts of them is their diagnosis. Well, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing to have your identity oriented around your diagnosis, because you're constantly thinking about whether something is going to inflame your diagnosis or make you feel worse or that kind of thing. So that's also a part of estrangement, is that people have also blamed their parents way too much for their outcomes. So again, if you look at Gen Z, they have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and suicide than any other generation that preceded them. And it's not because parents have suddenly become bad parents. It's not parents' fault. It's because of the role of social media and the downward comparison effects of social media, and being raised with the cell phone, where they're constantly being exposed to other people who supposedly are prettier, happier, smarter, more popular, etc. It's a very corrosive environment. But a lot of them are going to get into so-called trauma-informed therapies, were therapists who are, dumbasses, and assume that every problem in adulthood has a dysfunctional family at its heart. And then they're going to encourage them to, cut off their toxic family members, and really not be aware of the fact that, no, it's actually the fact that your client, your adolescent client, or your 20-something client, spends 6 to 8 hours a day on their cell phone, not because they had a dysfunctional parent. So these things really matter a lot. Right.
Also, we used to have a word for this overthinking everything, which was navel gazing, and nobody seems to mention that anymore. But I remember it being a big thing, like, navel gazing, get your head out of that, just go and do something.
Right.
So,
exactly. Right.
So coming back to estrangement and thinking about parents who might be struggling with this, what should a parent be asking themselves?
Well, you're not usually given a choice about it. I was just interviewed. There's a column out today where I was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal about how to avoid an estrangement. So I would encourage your listeners to read that, because we kind of go through everything. But typically, you're not given a choice. But you may be given kind of the ramp up. Your kid may have been complaining more and more. They may be talking about what they're learning in therapy, which you may not be able to relate to or identify with at all. I learned in therapy that you're a narcissist, or you're emotionally mature, or you neglected me. These are hard things for parents to hear. here, but parents are always better off kind of taking it seriously rather than defending themselves. So if there's a ramp up, it usually starts looking like that. Or if you have a conflict avoidant kid, maybe they're not telling you anything. They're just becoming less and less available, less and less willing to talk to you, less and less willing to get together. And in that case, you might have to show leadership and just say, look, I'm aware that you seem more distant, and maybe I haven't made it clear that, or made it feel safe to you to be able to complain about me. But if you do have complaints about me or how I'm interacting with you or the things that happened in the past, I would welcome that conversation.
Oh,
So
I
I don't
love
want you
that.
to feel it. Yeah, don't want you to feel worried about hurting my feelings or, making me feel bad. I mean, I actually would like to know. So some kids have to really be helped to complain about the parent, because sometimes estrangement is a form of conflict avoidance, just because the adult
Yes.
child doesn't have the words or the language or doesn't trust that the parent can tolerate their complaints. So they just kind of go out. They just go see ya.
Oh gosh, I love that. Yeah, and you did mention earlier the terrible impact that it has on parents. Can you explain or describe how it affects the body and mind of a parent if they end up estranged from their child?
Yeah, I mean, the research on emotional pain is that it sort of affects the same pain centers in the brain and the body as, actual physical pain. I did a retreat a few years ago with about 15 estranged parents, and one of the moms was talking about how she felt suicidal. And I said, well, so by a show of hands, how many other parents in this room at one time or another felt suicidal? Every single parent raised their hand.
Wow,
So,
no.
so it's just, is a testimony to how deeply painful and disorienting. And as one mother said to me, she said, nobody calls me mom anymore, which I thought was the most heartbreaking,
Yeah.
thing for a parent to say. It's kind of losing that identity. There's this field of research called mattering, which is just the idea that we have to matter to people, right? We have to feel like, particularly to our children, we have to feel like we matter to them, and to feel like we don't matter to them, that we're so inconsequential that we can just be erased from their lives, is incredibly, profoundly disorienting and heartbreaking and upsetting. So for the parent, yeah, the effects they're both physical and psychological.
And presumably there's also this sort of open sword where, okay, maybe they're coming back. So if there's a little bit of
Right.
contact and then there's no, that in itself must be torture.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a nightmare if your child dies, but there's closure. There's also kind of a repertoire of responses that people know to give to somebody who's, if they've lost a child, however uncomforting they may be. But for estrangement, it's what psychologist Pauline Boss refers to as an ambiguous loss, meaning that people don't really know how to respond to it. And it's not really, it's not identified in the same way that like a death in the family is, or even a divorce or something else where people, they probably had personal experience or they're close to somebody who has. Whereas estrangement, people often don't know what to say. And so often they say things that are kind of insensitive or out of tune with what that person really needs or wants. And it is ambiguous in the sense that the kid is out there. And if they're on social media, they
Mm.
can see them, and maybe they see them with the other
Oh.
parents, the in-laws, or they see pictures of the grandkids, but not because they're being sent, but because they can see them on Facebook if they haven't been blocked, which many have been. So been blocked from access to the social media. So it's just this kind of ongoing open wound that parents need enormous support to know how to manage and navigate.
Yes, and that's absolutely what I'm hearing is this shame tied up with this lack of any support and saying nobody's talking about it. Nobody, and the only people who have said things to this parent have made it much worse by making her feel like it was her fault and them saying, well, you need to do something. And she's
Right,
like, well, I've been
exactly.
doing everything I can.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and it's part of the reason that it's still a somewhat closeted issue is that most parents don't talk about it because they are worried about having that kind of response that, well, you must have done something terrible. I mean, kids don't just
Yeah.
cut off a parent for no reason. And it's true, they don't cut off a parent for no reason. It's just not, they don't always cut them off because it's the parent's fault, because the parent was so abusive or neglectful or harmful or whatever the popular culture causes people to believe.
So, okay, we've got parents of teenagers and tweens here. What can they do now to reduce a risk of future estrangement?
I mean, I think in general, keeping lines of communication open with your child at any age is always going to be the best the best strategy, showing yourself to be somebody who's capable of having corrective feedback. And, in some cultures and in some parents, that's a big ask, right? I mean, if you come from a culture or society where parental authority was the rule of the game, the idea of a parent being open to a child's feedback just feels like kind of an upset in the order of things. But you might have to, if you live in a Western society, you might have to modify that. And the number of Asian clients in my practice are the great minority, so it isn't like I have a lot. But those who do, particularly those who come from, say, China or India, which are two of the countries where I've sort of seen the most estrangements, they have a double disorientation, because not only is the disorientation from having the child cut them off, but it's also the disorientation of not having raised their child or grown up in a society anyway where that was considered a reasonable thing. And they in particular don't feel like they can talk to their friends or family about it because it's culturally considered so forbidden. So no matter what your culture though is, if you want to save your relationship with the kid and you live in a Western society, you kind of have to know that this is the new moral order. The old moral order of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, has given way to this much more I need to protect my mental health and my personal happiness. It's what the British sociologist Anthony Giddens refers to as the evolution to pure relationships. Those relationships purely constituted on the basis of whether or not that relationship's in line with that person's ideals for personal happiness and growth and identity. And if it's not, then get rid of them.
Is this ever going to shift back?
I suspect that it will eventually stop. I kind of think about this, my second book that I wrote in 2003, The Lazy Husband, How to Get Men to Do More Parenting and Housework, a title that endeared
Oh, I
me
need
to
to
men
get that.
everywhere. You're now on record, Rachel, for having said that. But anyway, when I wrote that book, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that women are now in the workforce and they can lead marriages, but men haven't yet made the transition to being kind of equal
Yes.
participators in terms of parenting and housework. But I think a lot of that has changed. So, for example, younger generations are much more likely to have an equal participation around parenting and housework. It's not perfect, but much more so than older generations. And so I suspect a similar thing will eventually happen here, because this is really the first generation of parents who've had to do this kind of huge moral shift and psychological shift. So, for the kids and millennials, those parents probably wouldn't have to do it as much. But the way that I think about it, the way that men kind of had to change in, say, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, well, more than that, probably well into the 2000s, they were kind of forced to change because women's increased economic power and because women could control their fertility and because they could leave their marriages. So all those things really empowered women to create a marriage that was much more in line with their ideals. I think similarly, adult children, now that they have the legitimization of therapists and therapy and social media, they are much more empowered to say, look, if you want a relationship with me, mom or dad, this is what it's going to look like. Otherwise, I don't have to be in relationship with you. And so I think that huge moral shift that's going on now, I do think eventually it's going to calm down. I think in the same way there will always be divorces, over these kinds of differences, there will always be estrangements. But I suspect the numbers that we're seeing right now, I would predict are going to go down. That's my hope.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. And just before we finish, I mean, do you think that we have a generation that's less skilled at relational repair, or are we getting better at this?
No. Well, no. For all the therapy, no. They're conflict avoidant. They spend way too much time on their cell phones or looking at social media. They have far less friends than older generations do. They're much more socially isolated. So in some ways that contradicts my point that they may be able to do it better because they're not necessarily in better relationships. But hopefully by the time they have children, they've kind of figured some of these things out. But no, younger generations are incredibly isolated and particularly boys. But girls too, they have fewer friends, they're more lonely. So it's a huge problem.
And finally, if you could tell parents one thing before their relationship breaks down or now, what would it be?
It would be to really take your child's complaints seriously, to not defend yourself, to not try to explain it away, to not get mad, to try to take it out of the realm of your child disrespecting you or not being grateful for all the sacrifices that you made for them, which were probably significant and probably more than your parents made for you. And to just put it much more purely in the context that your child is trying to have a conversation with you about something that's really important to them. And it's our duty as parents to take those conversations and those complaints seriously. We don't have to agree internally, but we have to be empathic and curious and interested if we want to preserve the relationship.
Brilliant. Dr. Coleman, absolutely brilliant. I'm so grateful for this. You've really given me some new perspectives on quite a few things there. I've already mentioned your Substack and one of your books. What else would you like to let people know about contacting you or getting hold of your work?
Yeah, no, I think my Substack, Family Troubles, my book, Rules of Estrangement, I think those are the most important things. My website, www.drjoshuacoleman, those are probably the best places to find me.
Amazing. And if you want to find me, I'm on Substack too. It's teenagersuntangled.substack.com. And I have a website, www.teenagersuntangled.com. And I take emails, teenagersuntangled@gmail.com. It's lovely having you on the program. Thank you so much. It's all the Teenagers Untangled. And I hope you have a great week. Big hug from me. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rachel.